Right. Well, according to my clock, we got 7:33. I want to be respectful for everybody's time. I want to thank you for joining us for the Los Angeles chapter Zoom meeting. I'm excited about the topic that we're speaking of today and our speaker. The meeting is being recorded and will be posted on the website. I would ask you to mute your line unless you're asking a question or speaking. The mute button is in the bottom left corner of your screen. If you're calling in by phone only, you can mute and unmute by hitting *6. Do we have any new members today that should be recognized? If you'd like to join CC, you can apply at on the website, cc.org. I'd like to introduce Dr. Stephen A. Call. Is a faculty member of the School of Design and Construction at Washington State University. He possesses more than 15 years of professional experience leading real estate construction and facility programs for the corporations in healthcare, defense, technology, and manufacturing. Dr. Call completed his PhD in construction management at Arizona State University. His Master of Science degree in real estate from Florida International University, and his Bachelor of Science degree in facilities management from Brigham Young University. His consulting and applied research efforts focus on methods to improve hospital facility management and operational performance. Thank you, Stephen, for presenting today. The floor is yours.
Hey, thanks, Tom. Appreciate it. Glad we could be together, even though it's virtually. I've met actually many of you on this call and other conferences, and some of you even heard this presentation. I know a lot of you on the call are not necessarily directly impacted by hospital benchmarking as you are suppliers or vendors, etc. But I promise you, as we work through this presentation, you'll find some value in this. And to tell you kind of the end from the beginning here, a lot of when it comes to operating expense benchmarking actually can help in predicting and estimating the costs associated with fixed assets for pre-construction and design processes within projects. So like I said, many of you are architects, engineers, and suppliers, and so we'll get to that and kind of talk about how this directly impacts the whole group. I like to keep this fairly informal. I know webinars that it's a little bit more formal just because we're all kind of on screens. But if you have a question, please just unmute yourself and speak up. Or you can submit a comment on the chat feature, and I'll try to check that occasionally. I'll also pause occasionally and just ask if there's any questions. So again, please speak up. Please ask any questions you might have, even if you feel like it's maybe not even totally aligned with what we're talking about. Usually some things come up, and it's great to just chat. Obviously, we'll take time at the end as well. And again, appreciate the introduction, Tom. A little bit of I will say, I am a professor at Washington State University, and so I do obviously have the academic lens and the research lens of what I'm doing, but I've been a hospital facility director. So these topics that I talk about are not abstract for me. I've been there, I've done that. Started my career at Texas Children's Hospital, actually in Houston. Mark and I actually just I think didn't quite cross paths there, but started my career there as a facility supervisor. Was a director of facilities at a medical center in the Champaign-Urbana area of Illinois, and so I definitely understand the world of healthcare. I'm part of a group called the Simplar Foundation, which is a group of applied researchers or faculty across the nation that really dedicate their energies towards facility management research specific to the industry. So if you ever see that logo, you may see occasionally here, that's what that is. I'm preaching to the choir here, but I do talk to a lot of facility managers that maybe aren't necessarily in healthcare. And the question is, well, why do I focus my research on healthcare? Why the energy specific to healthcare? Why don't I just talk about facility management generally? And I will tell you, I'm the only faculty in the country that dedicates their research program to healthcare operations. There's healthcare design, there's healthcare construction, but my research focuses specifically on healthcare operations or facility management in healthcare. And there's really two main reasons. It's one of the largest industries in the US. There's some numbers here. The data is a little old, but it kind of paints the picture. $4 trillion in on average, the industry spends 40 billion specifically spent on construction. So just kind of obviously helps put that in context. There's a lot of money spent on infrastructure, facilities in healthcare. So not only is it large, but it's also one of the fastest growing industries in the United States. So over the next handful of years through 2029, the US Bureau of Labor actually predicts that the job growth will be 15% within the healthcare industry, or over 2.4 million jobs. So what this kind of, what I think about is healthcare. It's big, it's growing. So when we have problems in healthcare, they're big problems, and unfortunately they grow. So this is an opportunity. Some of the research I do is an opportunity to kind of address some of the problems that we're all facing in healthcare facility management, and hopefully produce some solutions before those problems become so challenging that they really are too disruptive. So Deloitte did a study several years ago, and the question they had was a simple question, but an important question. And it was, what concerns are keeping hospital administrators up at night? I've given this presentation before, and I kind of asked for around the room what you think those are, but I'll pause for just a second and let you ponder this question, and then I'm going to kind of tell you what the answers are. But what concerns are keeping your hospital administrator up at night? What do you think it is? And I would venture to say that this is a really important question for you, to understand what it is that's on the mind of the administration in your hospital. So the top 4 concerns are here. Number 1 is changing Medicaid reimbursement. Number 2 is transition to value-based care. 3, improving margins. And 4, recruiting and retaining competent leaders. So the topic today is really focusing on this topic number 3, which is improving margins. I also do a lot of research and presentations and lectures on recruiting healthcare FM and technical talent, but that's for another day. But today we're going to talk a lot about profit margins. So we know that's a top concern of our hospital administrators. And so just a quick tutorial of, we've all heard the word profit margins. You're probably in a meeting with your CFO talking about the margins that they're experiencing. But how is that calculated? So it's important just to remember that there's really 2 levers that drive profit margins. The first lever is revenue. So it's just the income coming in from sales or healthcare services in a hospital. And the second one is operating operating income or operating expenses. So it's really increasing sales or decreasing expenses. And as facilities, primarily we're not in the market. We can't pull the lever of increasing sales. Occasionally you might have some space to lease. Maybe we manage the gift shop or something like that. That's part of our responsibility. But generally, we're in the world of we're managing an operating expense budget, and the only way to improve profit margins is to decrease our operating expenses. So as a result of this, the constant general feeling amongst healthcare facility managers that there's a lot of pressure to reduce operating expenses in facilities. And not only is there a lot of pressure to reduce expenses, but there's an expectation that you're maintaining a similar level of performance. So that's a challenge, right? When you feel this pressure, but the expectation is you're dropping expenses without changing performance. So we're going to talk a little bit about what can be done, or some tools that can be used to help mitigate some of these things. A lot of historically, a facility manager is just kind of, we get our budget and we say, oh, okay, I guess I'll do what I need to do. And it's been difficult to maybe push back or defend our position through kind of financial reasoning. We talk a lot about we're really busy, we've got a lot of work orders, but what are some other things that can speak the same language as our CFO to help us manage these pressures when it comes to budgets? So just as again, we're all familiar with this, but one of the reasons facilities are such a primary target for administration when it comes to profit margins and reducing costs is because facilities is one of the largest cost centers in a hospital. The number one largest cost center is people, or salary expenses, and we're typically not revenue generating. So, and when I talk about facility costs, there's various cost centers probably within your organization that's broken out by plant, EVS, linen, dietary, safety, security, transportation, et cetera, et cetera. So those are all under the umbrella of what I would call facility costs. So again, what can healthcare facility managers effectively do to manage this environment of doing more with less? Well, it's really about making the business case. And there's two pieces to this business case. One is the qualitative side, or telling the story of how facilities impacts the quality and healthcare experience for patients and staff. And there's also quantitative, which we'll talk kind of the rest of the presentation on. But when I say qualitative, again, qualitative is really telling a story with maybe not having hard data, but you're using it to touch on the experience, right? And you've all heard that in your time as a healthcare leader about patient experience, staff experience. And some examples of this is when we're trying to defend our position as far as budgeting, or we're trying to get some additional resources for whatever that might be. Just an example of, saying, hey, I need some funds for improving our landscape maintenance and improving our curb appeal, because it is improving patient satisfaction scores, for example. Justifying the spend on staff training because it's improving employee satisfaction or retention, right? Those are some qualitative. It's still data that's being measured, but it's more qualitative. It's more about how people are feeling, how people are thinking. Now, the second part of this is what we're going to discuss through the remainder of the presentation, but it's the quantitative side. So now you're telling the story about how facilities is really impacting the finances of the healthcare business. So we all know that managing facilities is a cost of doing business. There's no way the administration can say, we just don't need facilities. There are some organizations, luckily, not healthcare, but that have decided, especially since COVID, hey, we don't even need an office anymore. We can just work from home. Whether that lasts, how long that lasts, who knows? But when it comes to healthcare, in especially acute care, obviously, it's just a cost of doing business. And so the key is really measuring the work demand. The best way to do that, or understanding what your true cost of owning the facility or managing the facility is actually measuring your work demand through your CMMS. So if you have a robust CMMS program, you should be able to, I know that 80% of my work is done through PMs. It takes about X number of hours to do those, times whatever cost that is, and we've got some corrective. And so you should be able to calculate that and say, we spend X number of hours on average every year doing preventative and corrective work. here's the hours and et cetera, right? The challenge with that is when I ask, who's done that before, very few have, simply because you have to have a fairly robust system, and you have to have the human resources on the ground, or the CMS administrator that's really analyzing that information and interpreting that information, and it's just cumbersome. The easiest way as a quick starting point is actually just a benchmark. So that's what we're going to talk about today, is how can you benchmark what your costs of managing a facility should be? What should your staffing levels be? What should your maintenance costs be? Just based on a fairly quick, easy model for benchmarking. So I'm going to stop here just for a second and see if there's any questions to this point. If not, that's just fine. Okay, so we're going to talk now got to go into a little more detail on benchmarking. What is benchmarking? How does it work? What are some tools out there that we can use? So the steps for benchmarking, there's really 4 primary steps. The first step is developing and measuring internal processes. So if you can't measure your own internal processes, then you're not really going to be successful at benchmarking. Now you can look internally, but if you can't even, for example, if your accounting system doesn't even break out costs by facility. So if you're trying to say, what are my purchase services, what are my utility costs for this facility and that, facility A and facility B. But if your accounting system doesn't even break that out, then you're trying to dig up invoices from a utility company, right? It can be cumbersome. So you're wanting to make sure that you have internal processes that can actually break out the costs that you're trying to look at and compare. Another example is job description. So if you have hospital A, where the engineering employee also handles 50% of the EVS requirements, but you've got facility B where you've got full-time construction people, you've got engineering technicians dedicated, and you've got EVS, right? Those job descriptions, you're not comparing apples to apples when you're trying to say, well, what should my staffing numbers be between hospital A and hospital B? And they're all so different in what they do. So that's really important to try to standardize that and make sure you're standardizing that across your organization. The next thing then to do is actually to look externally to say, okay, well, what are other hospitals like me doing, and how am I comparing? And that's what we call external benchmarking. Thirdly, you identify the performance gaps. You say, well, hey, I externally benchmarked my staffing levels, and I'm at, adjusted for size, I'm at 20 FTEs, and the benchmark appears to be 30. So there's a significant enough difference there, or gap there, that you're going to raise a red flag and say, it looks like I'm understaffed. Why am I understaffed? Am I understaffed, or maybe I'm just paying more, maybe I'm just outsourcing more, and so it makes sense, right? So benchmarking is not a silver bullet. Benchmarking is just simply an easy tool to say, am I in the ballpark? Are there any major red flags that are being raised as I look at these numbers? And then it helps you then initiate and manage performance improvements. So then you can say, well, hey, I've looked at all the data, I've done some research, and yeah, I am a bit understaffed compared to peers. And so then it can, there's some evidence, there's some data there that can then help you drive performance improvements. So even though most healthcare facility managers recognize that there is value in benchmarking, what I found that unfortunately very few hospitals actually do benchmark their facility operating or staffing levels. Or if they do benchmark, it's almost the handful are almost just internally. And so the question is, well, why on earth, if we all, if I had everybody raise their hand and say, do you believe benchmarking is valuable? Most of you, I think, would agree, but very few are doing this. And I've done this presentation enough that that's a recurring theme. So the question is why? Like why aren't we as healthcare facilities, why aren't we benchmarking? There's definitely value there. It's not that difficult. And there's some reasons. And there's a couple primary reasons. why I think this is the case. So the primary reason is existing benchmarks are dated, they're difficult to interpret, and they're not comprehensive. So very good reasons why benchmarking historically has not been done, right? Old data, difficult to deal with and understand and interpret, and it's not comprehensive. So I will tell you that there, and I'll show you a slide here in a minute, but IFMA and ASHE combined to provide a benchmarking report back in 2010. So what is that? 12 years ago. Many of you are probably familiar with that benchmarking report. It seems to be the if you do benchmark, that's the report you've probably used. You can Google it, and it's available. You can find it. But again, it's 12 years old. The only metrics that are used on that report are gross square footage and adjusted patient days. And this is a direct quote from when it says defining what adjusted patient days is and how you calculate it. This is a direct quote from the report. And it says adjusted patient days is calculated by dividing total charges by inpatient charges, then multiplying by the number of inpatient days and admissions. Gross revenue divided by inpatient revenue times inpatient days equals adjusted patient days. So what I talk about is difficult to interpret. That's an example of like, what on earth is that? And how do I calculate adjusted patient day, right? It can be cumbersome. It can be difficult. We could probably eventually figure it out, but it's not super intuitive. And the other thing it's missing in that report is that there's no salary or compensation data. So as I mentioned, it'll show you, okay, based on your square footage and your patient days, this is about how many, EVS employees you should have at your hospital. But it doesn't show you what your compensation expense should be. So how do I know if the hospital down the road that I'm comparing myself to isn't just outsourcing everything, right? So that's a really important factor that's just simply not there. And so there's not a lot of confidence to kind of go to your administration and say, hey, the benchmark says I should be 30, I'm only 20, I need 10 employees. And the simple question is, well, how do we know that our compensation data isn't at benchmark? Well, I don't know that. Okay, well then that's really important. And then the last thing I'll mention about some of the reasons why benchmarking has not been prevalent historically is IBM Action OI. So I'm just bringing this up as a warning. Historically, if you've been benchmarked or your administration or your finance team has come to you and said, hey, we've benchmarked facilities, this is where you should be, this is where your new budget should be, I would venture to guess that that's coming from IBM Action OI data. That's a benchmarking database that not only addresses facilities, but it addresses a lot of healthcare data throughout the hospital. For some reason, I just finished a big benchmarking report for the VA system. And what I found is that IBM Action OI data grossly underrepresents the true cost of facilities. So what I'm telling you is if you've been benchmarking against IBM, you're probably looking at things saying, how on earth it's saying I should be, 100,000 on maintenance and I've got $1 million budget. Like IBM Action OI data, for some reason, it's just not comparing favorably to other benchmarks out there. So just as a kind of as a warning or a heads up, that the beauty is that what I'm going to be talking about next is that there are other tools out there now that can actually help you kind of defend your position. So when you get a report from your finance team saying this is what you should be, you can now say, no, I've got some other information, I've got some other tools, and this is where I should really be, right? So this is what's helpful. So in 2020, IFMA did come out and publish a new benchmarking report. It's available. You can purchase it on their website. It's obviously coming from hundreds of, I was an advisor on this benchmarking report. It's coming from hundreds of facilities across the U.S. And it is some good data, some current data that can be used. There's still some gaps in it, right? It still doesn't have compensation information in it. but it's at least something. And I have some other data that if you ever are interested in benchmarking and you want to use the new IFMA report, I have some other kind of proprietary information that I can support you if you want to get a little more detailed. But there are some limitations. So even if we said, okay, well, we've got some current data now, let's benchmark. Well, there still are some limitations, and I don't want to be ignorant of that. So the limitations to benchmarking are what I'll call peer comparison equivalence. So a lot of times it's like, well, it's benchmarking in hospitals isn't fair because we're being compared to office buildings, or that's just not, which is true. It's unfair to compare an office building to a hospital, or to say, well, my system is rural and all these, all the data is coming from urban systems, and so it's just not a fair comparison. So yes, that is true if that's what's happening. You obviously wouldn't want to look at a benchmark report that's coming from office. You want to make sure that it's as fair as possible, or it's as similar as possible. Ratiometric comparison equivalence is saying sometimes there's different measurements for different standards. So even gross square footage, for example, if we all grabbed a tape measure and measured the same room, we'd all come up with a different number. And that's an example of ratiometric comparison equivalence. Limited insight into factors contributing to peer performance. So I can't tell if the numbers that are coming from that hospital, if they're outsourcing their trades. I can't tell if their FTE levels are reduced because they're managed, or are higher because they're managing all their construction in-house. Like there's some peer performance factors that we just sometimes can't see. And another one is best practices are simply invalid if the overall industry is facing similar challenges. So if everybody in healthcare has a workforce shortage, then the benchmark data is not really that valid because everybody's understaffed. And then lastly, self-reporting. So at the end of the day, most of the data is coming from folks like yourselves that are just reporting what your numbers are. So there's a lot of reasons why we don't do benchmarking, why there's some limitations to it. But what I would tell you is that yes, there are limitations, there are some barriers, but we have to recognize what benchmarking is and why we use it. Benchmarking is not to get an exact number, to say this is exactly what I should be having as far as my staffing, this is exactly what I should be having as far as my compensation expense. Benchmarking is just an opportunity to say, hey, I just want to see generally, am I in the ballpark? Am I within a reasonable range, which I usually interpret anywhere from around 10 to 20%. If I'm within 10 or 20% of benchmarking, I'm comfortable that I'm doing okay. If I'm 100% over benchmark or under benchmark, that's the beauty of what benchmarking can do, is it can highlight those areas where you're saying, okay, it didn't take me much time to do this, and I'm seeing that there's a huge gap in what my peers are doing and what I'm doing, and so why? And then that'll help you dive into it. So that's the beauty of benchmarking, even though there are truly some limitations. The traditional approach to benchmarking has always been gross square footage. So an example of this, which you're all probably familiar with, is electricity expense. So on average, across the US, this is a real number, hospitals spend about $2 a square foot on electricity. Obviously, depending on where you are in the country, that number is wildly different. So in a perfect correlation, meaning if every hospital spent $2 per 1 square foot, there would be no other factors that are affecting electricity expense. So a 2-to-1 ratio, if there was a perfect correlation, meaning that no matter what, as long as I know what my gross square footage is, I can strongly predict, or understand what utility expenses are. But we all know that's not true, because it depends on where you're located, what's the age of your infrastructure, what type of equipment you have in your facility, your humidity levels, right? All those things impact electricity costs. So while the ratio or the average is truly $2 for every 1 gross square foot, the reality is there's a lot of variance in that. And So the question I had in some of this research that I did was, is there a better metric other than gross square feet that could determine facility expenses that would hold its ratio irrespective of other factors? So is there another factor besides gross square footage, for example, that we could use that regardless if you're in California or Maine, regardless if you're in a warm climate or a cold climate, that it would still be $2 a square foot, no matter what? That was my question, is because a lot of the conversations about benchmarking in the past, especially in healthcare, is like, hey, gross square footage, it's not a fair metric because of what goes on in healthcare, right? And which is true, which I believe. So a little statistics tutorial. This is showing correlation strengths. Okay, so a positive or a negative, a strong correlation is where you have all of your data points. So let's assume that these are 7 or 8 hospitals in California that, and this is a 2-to-1. The blue line is a 2-to-1 ratio. Okay, that's for every 1 square foot, you've got $2 of cost. Okay, so these X's are the data. So it's saying, in general, most of these hospitals are falling pretty closely in line with that 2-to-1 ratio. That's a strong correlation. Over here to the far right, where you've got these X's all over the place, that's an example of where there's no pattern at all. There's no correlation. There's no line that can kind of help us predict what that should be. So this would be an example of if you said, okay, what's your utility expense per the number of Porsches in the parking lot? Okay, there's no correlation at all. Okay, it just doesn't make sense. Correlation strength is saying if there is a perfect correlation. So if I go back here and let's say every single one of these data points hit exactly on that blue line, that would be a 1. That would be a perfect correlation. So it's saying no matter what, that metric that we're using is, there's no other factors that are attributing to that. It's always going to be always going to fall in that perfect line. That's a 1 correlation. Typically, that's in nature, that's almost never there. And so as long as it's above a 0.5, you can say, okay, that's a fairly strong correlation. So I say that because what I did was I looked at all the Department of Health sites and looked at utilization reports from hospitals, financial statements from hospitals. And the most common metrics, or what you probably are familiar with, is admissions, discharges, available and licensed beds, patient days, and gross square footage. So those are all common metrics that are used in hospitals. And I also looked at the balance sheet or the financials and noticed that plant, property, and equipment value. I thought that might be a good metric to compare. So looking at hospital metrics and cost information, I was trying to verify if gross square footage was a sound metric for hospital facility benchmarking and explore other metrics that might have a stronger correlation to facility costs. And so with the data, this is kind of the finding. This is really important. So if you want to peer into your screen, it's probably a little small, but the findings are if on the top you'll see the different metrics. So beds, patient days, admissions, gross square footage, and plant, property, and equipment values. And on the first column here, those are the different cost accounts. So the total plant operating expense, it has some various roll-up costs, right? You got maintenance, utilities, salaries, etc. And then I'm also showing EVS. So what it's showing is that regardless of utilization of the key utilization metrics, whether you use beds, patient days, admissions, gross square footage, or plant, property, and equipment, any one of those metrics is actually a pretty strong correlation to facility costs. Now, I will highlight that this is for large hospitals. So a hospital greater than about 150,000, 200,000 square feet. Same thing with EVS. So EVS costs, regardless of the metric you use, they're all going to have strong correlations to housekeeping expenses. However, the highest when it comes to plant operations is actually plant property and equipment, which is interesting because this is a metric that has really never been looked at historically. We've always looked at gross square footage or patient days primarily. But plant property and equipment value is actually showing it has the strongest correlation to facility operating expenses. Now, what's interesting is when you start looking at smaller hospitals. When you're looking at smaller hospitals, all of a sudden these correlation strengths drop quite a bit. So now admissions is still strong, plant property and equipment is still reasonably strong, but beds, patient days, and gross square footage are actually weak correlations. So you could pick any metric you want and compare that to utility costs, and it's going to give you the same number. That's why there has been a lack of confidence in some of these benchmarking studies, is because if gross square footage is the primary metric, or patient days is the primary metric, and you have a smaller hospital and you're looking at your number like these numbers are nowhere even close to where my hospital should be, or these don't even look reasonable. Well, that's the reason. So again, the ASHE report and IFMA report in 2010 that was pushing this issue of adjusted patient days, the correlation of facility costs when it comes to patient days is 0.2, which is again, you can pick any metric you want. Pick the number of I always say pine trees because I'm in Washington State, but the number of pine trees in your in your front lawn to utility costs. Like there's no correlation, and there's simply no correlation to patient days and facility costs when it comes to smaller hospitals. So I'll stop there for a moment and see if anybody has any questions or comments about these findings. Okay, so the good news is now you know, right? You really shouldn't, if you're at a smaller hospital, you really should not be using patient days as a metric to compare your facility costs when you're looking at various benchmarking reports. And generally, gross square footage is across the board is not a reliable metric either. I mean, if you're just looking at large hospitals, you can do that. But across the board, we shouldn't. We really should be careful with gross square footage. The real key here is that best overall metric when you're looking at facility cost benchmarking is actually plant property and equipment values and admissions. Those are the two metrics that have the strongest correlation, regardless of size, regardless of location, whatever it might be. Those have very strong correlations to plant and EVS costs. Now, I will note that PP&E, the key there is if you're where do you find that? It's on your balance sheet. You just call up your accountant and say, hey, what's our PP&E values? But it's gross PP&E. There's a difference between gross and net. Net is actually has been reduced over time from depreciation. You simply want the gross PP&E number. Okay, so an example of how this benchmarking report can be helpful is now it's simply a matter of, because those metrics have strong correlations to plant expenses, you can simply have a ratio and multiply it, and you've got your benchmark. So if I want one that most of us are familiar with, and even though I just said it's not the most reliable metric, we all are pretty familiar with what our number is gross square feet, for example. So if you know what your gross square footage is for your hospital, just multiply it by about $22, and that's your benchmark for total operating expenses. If you know what your admissions are, you multiply it by 1,217. So what it's saying is for every one admission that your hospital has, it costs about $1,200 per year in operating expenses for facilities. Now, what's really important is when you do benchmarking, you have to understand the nuances within your hospital as well. So for example, I provided a benchmark study for a health system in Colorado. They were almost primarily outpatient. So they had a lot of square footage, but they didn't have a lot of acute care type environment. So admissions obviously would not be a very good metric to use for them because they had very low admissions, but really, a lot of gross square footage. So I typically like to look at a variety of these different metrics, make sure I understand the mix of the portfolio to use the right metric. But that's an example of why you kind of have to look at these metrics with the insight of the way your portfolio is mixed. So let me just see here. So what this can do is it can help justify your facility costs. So if you're saying I'm getting pressure from my administration to reduce FTE levels, I'm getting, I'm being told that my operating budget is too high relative to what this Action OY report is saying. Now there's data out there that you can say, look, there's been research done. This is more in line with what I should be doing. And so it helps justify, not only justify your existing facility costs, but it helps justify some asks, right, for additional resources. Now, for all of you who are contractors or architects or service providers, what's really interesting about this ratio model is it can actually help predict future operating expenses based on planned construction. So on your balance sheet, there's a section in there called construction work in progress, which is simply just plant, property, and equipment that isn't yet in service. So it's going to have the same correlation. So if you know what your expected capital costs are for an upcoming project, you can use that construction work in progress amount and project out based on these ratios. You can understand what your future operating expenses will be. So that's valuable for value engineering, for example. So if you find something that you were able to remove from the cost of the project, you can say, not only did I save you X number of dollars in capital expense for the project, but this just saved you, operating expenses every year. So that's really powerful. And from an operator's perspective or a facility director's perspective, you can now know early what you should be getting as far as your budget. So you can predict your operating budget instead of waiting around until the building's built and you're given a budget that isn't reasonable. You can now know what that is and have a conversation with accounting early, ideally even before the project's approved, to understand what your annual operating expense should be. Any questions on that? On predicting operating expenses using this model for construction or design? Okay, and I will say this is the first time I've showed this slide because I literally just finished analyzing some of the data as of yesterday. But what I'm finding in the research is that and I defined, it's important to define deferred maintenance because this term is talked about a lot. My definition of deferred maintenance is really related to operating expenses. So if your operating expenses are below what benchmark should be, then you're in a deferred maintenance situation. And so that delta, that gap between what you're spending and what you should spend, that's your annual deferred maintenance. So if you're in a state of deferred maintenance, which means that your operating expenses are below external benchmarking, you're in a state of deferred maintenance. Those hospitals that are in a deferred maintenance situation spend significantly more on facility infrastructure capital. And by the way, that's adjusting for growth. So I'm not talking about, well, somebody could argue, well, yeah, because they're spending all this money on new buildings. That's adjusted. That's adjusted out. So based on no growth, same infrastructure, same existing portfolio, hospitals in a deferred maintenance situation are actually spending more on capital costs. And we can kind of all make assumptions of why that is, but I think the big one is simply we're not spending enough to maintain our existing infrastructure, and so it's costing us more frequent replacement cost on our equipment and infrastructure. So what that can tell us is, okay, well, first of all, we should know, are we in a deferred maintenance? I mean, we can all say, well, I think I am, but we should know if we're in a deferred maintenance situation. And by the way, how much? Because depending on how far beyond the deferred maintenance situation we're in, will tell us how much extra we're paying in capital costs comparatively. So, and if we can align, if we can justify that, hey, you know, I'm in a deferred maintenance situation, I need X number of dollars more to kind of align with benchmark, then you can actually prove or show through evidence that you're going to be saving X number of dollars every year in capital spend. And I know that's not as easy as I make it sound, because capital and expenses aren't created equal in the eyes of you know, finance. But it's a powerful tool to say, look, you know, there's additional justification for increasing my operating expenses to align with budget or align with benchmark. So that's a really interesting finding. And I think we've all kind of probably felt that and assumed that, but there's actually evidence now to support that position. Any questions on that?
Yeah, Steve, I have a couple questions. So, you know, I think some of the challenges that I've seen as we look at benchmarking is none of these metrics align with what is the actual installed equipment. So I could have a central plant, you know, I could have a 500-bed hospital and I got 2 generators. Or I could have a campus that's been, you know, built up over time and has like 8 buildings for those 500 beds and have 9 generators, right? The cost of maintenance, in my opinion, is associated with the equipment that you have to maintain. So has there been any work done on, you know, how much does it cost to maintain a generator or a chiller or a cooling tower, you know, that can be looked at based upon, you know, the design of your campus?
Yeah, so Tom, great question. That's the beauty of plant, property, and equipment values as a new metric to look at when looking at benchmarking, is because, for example, gross square footage, historically, you're saying, well, that's not fair. I have 100,000 square feet that's supported by 15 generators. So, you know, there's a much higher maintenance cost to that type of facility, even though gross square footage isn't encompassing some of these additional pieces of equipment. That's what plant, property, and equipment values does, is it looks at the value of the property and the equipment associated with that facility. So that's one reason why I believe it has such a strong correlation, and why it carries its correlation regardless of size in a large or a small hospital. And so what this is saying is that this 0.83 is saying, well, if you know what your plant, property, and equipment value is, in essence, there's about an 83% confidence level that there aren't any other factors that are associated with that. There are going to be some other factors, right? We can't explain away everything. Benchmarking is not perfect. So there's 17% of other things going on that are you know, impacting our plant expenses. But 0.83 honestly is a extremely high correlation. So what I would say, Tom, is that if you use PP&E as your metric, you're going to have a much higher level of confidence. Now, it's a much more reliable tool to feel confident that the numbers you're getting back are actually related to what's going on in that facility. So that's what's new about this research, is that PP&E has never been looked at historically, and now it is. And as an advisor on the new IFMA report that came out in 2020, they took my my findings and actually included that as a metric. So you now have that as an option when you're looking at benchmarking.
So Stephen, when we talk about PP&E, if I've got equipment that's 50 years old, those equipment values are much lower than if I have new equipment.
If you're looking at net, correct, you are correct, but this is looking at gross. And so those values don't change. So whether now what the beauty of PP&E is that over time, right, you're going to be dumping capital spend into that building through repairs, replacements, right? And so even though that generator is 50 years old, you're still adding an additional capital spend over time that's going to be kind of keeping that number up. So what this is showing is that regardless of the age of your infrastructure, that PP&E number still is holding pretty strong to what your operating expenses are. Sorry, Tom, I didn't mean to cut you off. Did you have a comment on that?
I guess my I think you explained it away there.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, and that's what's really important, because I'm talking gross. If you're talking net PP&E, you're like, yeah, well, over time it's being depreciated, and so that doesn't, that wouldn't make sense. And by the way, there isn't a good correlation between net PP&E for that very reason. But the gross PP&E is a pretty much a fixed number that stays on the balance sheet, unless the asset is just sold, then it comes off. Great, thanks, Tom. Appreciate the questions. Anybody else have any comments or questions before I move on?
Yes, Stephen, this is Mark.
Hey, Mark.
A question. Did you define earlier, did I miss it, what in your research was included in the OpEx group? I know that varies sometimes from.
Yeah, so let me show you, let's see if I can find the slide here. Sorry, give me a second. I do. Here we go. So these are the cost. When I say plant operating expenses, the roll-up costs are maintenance, otherwise known as purchase services, utilities, salaries, wages, and benefits, depreciation, and other expenses. So the other expenses is really just maybe 5% approximately of the total. And then when it comes to EVS expense, you got salaries, wages, benefits, supplies, and other. So those are the roll-up costs associated with plant operations.
So are you including both of those in your data, or are they separate?
So the data that when I'm showing you this number, right, when I show you total plant OpEx,
yeah,
of 2181, this is the total plant OpEx, is including all the roll-up costs. Now, I also have, if you're interested, shoot me an email and we can talk about, I actually have ratio numbers for, if you want to, okay, well, I just want to know what my maintenance cost should be, or I just want to know what my salary cost should be, right? I have some numbers that are, so it's a portion of this 2181 would be your compensation, et cetera, et cetera.
Sure. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. Many folks don't have depreciation as part of their total plant expense because it's captured differently and again, that can be pulled out. Again, it's just a portion of that 2181. So there's different ways you can play with it to make it work. Great. Any other questions? Oh. Yeah.
I did have one question. So on the equipment cost, is that just fixed equipment like at the plant, or would that also include imaging equipment, say?
So when it comes to plant property and equipment values, it's including, that is including all fixed assets associated with the plant. So that is including what we'll call, now, if you look at the balance sheet, typically you can break that out. Like you can look at fixed assets specific to the building, and you can look at other fixed assets. the PP&E value, the gross PP&E value that I'm using is encompassing all equipment. And that makes sense in the fact that, right, when it comes to utilities, for example, it doesn't matter if it's a chiller or it's an MRI, it's pulling electricity. So, and anyway, so that's the short answer. Yes, it's including all fixed assets related to that's attributed to that facility.
Okay.
Now, the challenging part, if you're trying to benchmark, for example, I mean, let's say you got 20 clinics, but you don't have a way to break out your costs by clinic, and you just say, well, I've got one cost center clinics, and there's 20 buildings, and my PP&E value for all 20 buildings is this. And that's when it starts getting a little tricky to say, well, how do you maybe understand the benchmarking individually by hospital? It just depends on how your accounting is structured.
Thanks.
Yeah. Well, again, I'll be available for questions as well, but I'll kind of wrap up here. How can healthcare facilitators then effectively manage increasing pressure to do more with less? That was kind of what we started with, right? This idea of profit margins, and this expectation to do more with less. Well, step one is benchmark. Where are you in the grand scheme of things as far as your costs? How are you comparing to peers? It's a good way to start and try to kind of understand that and have some evidence to then support your position for your budget. So if you're interested in benchmarking, it's just a matter of starting to gather your facility costs, which most of you have access to because you're managing that budget, and then comparing benchmarks internally and externally to justify budgets, to identify gaps you might have, and then using the data to support budget funding. Benchmarking is not a silver bullet. It's not going to tell you exactly, this is exactly the number you should be at, but it's going to tell you, hey, am I in the ballpark? Am I reasonably comfortable that I'm not missing, that I'm effectively managing this facility or my portfolio? It's quick, it's easy, and it's a good way to provide some real evidence. So I appreciate the opportunity to share this with you today. Here's my email. If you ever have any questions about benchmarking, about any type of healthcare facility challenge you're having, I would love to connect and chat with you. So again, open to any questions that anybody still might have about the presentation. Great. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Call. Appreciate the useful information here. I'm sure people will think of questions later, and thank you for providing your email to have access to your wealth of knowledge.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
So Brian, next on the agenda is announcement. Brian was unable to make the meeting today. He's dealing with a sickness. So the announcements that he provided were that, we want to thank all the gold and silver sponsors for your support. Without our sponsors, our organization would not be able to survive with this mission of, providing education, for our facility leaders and members. Membership benefits. As a member, you're not limited to only participating in the LA chapter, but other chapters allowing you to connect and listen to topics of your interest. Mock survey or survey readiness. I have a little bit of information on this. We have been experiencing a delay in the Joint Commission, and when they had targeted us 3 years ago to where they are now, the delays are anywhere between 4 weeks late to 15 weeks, and that's through 3 different sites through Adventist Health. We're also experiencing that there's a shortage of surveyors. So the life safety surveys have been shortened in some occasions. And in talking to peers in Northern California, the life safety surveyors have not even accompanied the clinical team. They've, surveyed on a different schedule because of the shortage of surveyors. But anybody that has had a survey and they want to share their experience, we welcome you to reach out to Brian. We can get you on the agenda. We're also looking for conference room spaces at vendor locations in Southern California. We'd like to do these meetings in person. I know most of the hospitals are still kind of locked down to having group meetings. So if you have a space, please reach out to Brian. We've got the Southern California Seminar is scheduled for September 15th in Long Beach. The Northern California Seminar, October 20th in Fairfield. Golf tournaments, we have Orange County Golf Tournament, June 28th. And we have the San Diego Golf Tournament, August 18th. We have next month, we're going to be with Forensic Analytical with Smoke is in the Air. If you have a topic that you would like to are interested in hearing about, please reach out to Phil, Brian, or myself, and we will try to find a appropriate speaker on that topic. And that is it for the announcements. I want to thank everybody for their participation today. I know everybody's got busy schedules. I want to thank Dr. Call for his presentation. Thank you for providing a wealth of information to us, and I hope you all have a blessed day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.